Here's a common way that Remainers frame Brexit. Like a parent of a wayward young adult who's determined to hurt themselves by their behavior, I watch brokenhearted. The really sad thing about Brexit is that over the next 10 to 15 years, we will slowly realize what we have lost and why we joined in the first place. Like your parents telling you your school days are the best years of your life, and you don't believe them until it's too late. Brexit really does spell the end of the UK. So sad. Like hearing divorcing parents tell kids, we'll be friends. To everyone marching at London Pride? Are you fucking a chicken down there? To the Remainers, the UK is an uppity child, a hormonal teenager, while the EU is the wise, benevolent father. The UK's desire for freedom from the EU is rash, misinformed, immature, and can only lead to disaster, a specific type of disaster that only the experience of the EU and the Remainers advocating for it can foresee. And maybe that's the case. When, or if, Brexit happens, everyone agrees that the UK will take an economic hit, and the pragmatic argument of staying in the EU to avoid a short to middle-term depression is a reasonable one. Just like not all Brexiteers are racists, not all Remainers are card-carrying progressives. A lot of them just want to avoid a very obvious economic pitfall. But the primary argument for Brexit, at least as far as I can tell, is the desire of the citizens of the UK to reclaim the sovereignty of their own country. It's so that the UK is ruled by their own parliament in London. It's so that parliament is the highest legal authority in the land, and not subordinate to an even greater power structure within the EU. The EU is notoriously undemocratic. The only body of the EU directly elected by the citizens is the European Parliament. And unlike an actual parliamentary democracy, the European Parliament does not have the right of initiative, the right to put forward legislation for a vote. The European Parliament can only approve or reject if legislation handed to them from the European Commission. Compare this to the Canadian system, where the House of Commons has the right of initiative, but the Senate does not. Or the American one, where both Congress and the Senate have the right, but both houses must approve any bill regardless of where it starts. In both examples, at least one body has both the right of initiative and is directly democratically elected by the population. This is not the case with the EU. Most Brexiteers recognize this situation as unacceptable for a free country, and want to return the sovereign power to their own parliament. Their position is primarily focused on the right of self-determination, not secondary issues like immigration or economics. Oftentimes, when you engage a Remainer online, their default position will be that Brexiteers are simply angry racists. When you bring up the issue of sovereignty, they almost always go silent, because they know there's no real argument against the right of self-determination. The progressive go-to on self-determination for the past 50 years was that more methods of living were valid beyond the narrow interpretation provided by religious traditionalism, and that people had the right to live in an unorthodox or unpopular manner. The smartest among them know to simply clam up when people choose to exercise their rights to, say, leave the EU. But that's not always how it goes down. In a minority of cases, when presented with the sovereignty argument, the Remainer will reply in the manner that I began this video with. The UK's desire for freedom over security is childish, and the patient parent that is the EU will be saddened, but will allow their wayward son to destroy themselves. And a significant portion of the British electorate are complicit in this infantilization of their character. The idea that the British, as a people, are perpetual children that need tending to by their European parents has taken root quite strongly ever since those same children voted to leave the EU. I mean, there's a lot of contradictions here. The British are simultaneously the greatest colonial tyrants the world has ever seen, as well as a baby race requiring a firm European hand. Or that the prevailing metaphor for the situation is Britain represented by the rashness of youth, when it was overwhelmingly older people who voted to leave. But forget about that stuff, it doesn't matter. This idea that the citizens need constant guiding by a nanny state is overwhelmingly the most prevailing position within both the government and the media. Hate incidents that do not break any laws but are considered to be wrongful uses of free speech are met with a friendly visit from the police. Lawful speech, ranging from peaceful protests, to comedy, to rational critique of sensitive topics, are all stifled under the guise of safety. Violent or sexual content, something legal that any adult should be allowed to partake in, is slowly becoming banned. The entire British Isles is becoming child-proofed, with caps on the power outlets and cushioned corners on the coffee tables. And this care-for-me mentality has filtered into the UK's parliament, which is one big reason why they don't want to deliver Brexit. Doing so means they'll actually be in charge of running the place. What they do will have serious impact with serious consequences and require serious responsibility from them in order to do their jobs. They won't simply be the EU's rubber stamp, they'll be the ultimate authority. And frankly, the British MPs right now don't want the pressure. That's why they're all having a collective breakdown at the prospect. Expending so much energy betraying the people that voted them in is finally getting to them, I guess. The prodigal son metaphor is one that Remainers like to use when framing the EU as a benevolent authority and the UK as a bratty kid. I wish the UK would just acknowledge that Brexit is just a bad idea and stop this disaster from happening. I think the EU is waiting with open arms, ready to welcome the UK back like the prodigal son. The prodigal son, for those of you who don't know, is a Bible story. A wealthy father has two sons. The younger son asks for his inheritance early, receives it, and promptly goes out and wastes it all frivolously. He experiences destitution and hardship and returns home hat in hand, expecting to be a servant of the family. Instead, his father welcomes him home, telling his angered older son that the younger one has finally learned humility. The lesson is obvious. God forgives those who sin and repent. The problem with using the story for a real-world scenario like Brexit, though, is that the EU is not God. In real life, all children eventually leave the nest. If the argument is that the UK's desire for freedom from the EU is fundamentally childish, that would imply that the UK is destined to eventually leave the EU. If not now, then a little bit later, when the UK is a bit more mature and the EU is a bit closer to death. And frankly, the EU's close enough, isn't it? But okay, Remainers, if we're going to use the Bible to describe the situation, let's use the Bible. Let's talk about the Tower of Babel. You know, where humans got too proud of their accomplishments, built a giant tower to try and reach heaven, and God decided to teach them a lesson by destroying the tower and forcing all the people to speak different languages. I'm an atheist. I don't care about the religious implications of the Babel story. For someone like me, the meaning is quite clear. The biggest threat to humanity, with the exception of the chaotic nature of reality, is the tendency for human social structures to become too large, too slow, and too blind. And when that happens, they are inevitably doomed to disintegration and collapse. This is, for example, why libertarians prefer smaller government, because they understand that an excessively large government has a tendency to overreach, overconsume, and eventually implode under the weight of their own bureaucracy. We can see this in the EU, a large unwieldy superstate, enduring a financial crisis due to its rapid expansion into Eastern Europe. Its disintegration and collapse has begun in the form of Brexit, where its constituent parts are slowly deciding that the grand European project is too much trouble than it's worth, and are all looking to go their own ways, like humanity after the destruction of Babel. People who use terminology like crashing out of the EU to refer to a hard Brexit know this implicitly. They know that even the simple act of leaving the EU will cause catastrophic damage to the cause. That's why, before the referendum, the common position was that the UK has an obligation to not destroy the EU by leaving it. Of course, to some degree, the modern world, with its modern problems, requires more complex solutions than ever before, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a simplistic government that can pull off a complex solution. But the answer isn't to build a Tower of Babel, an ever-increasing, all-consuming European nightmare state lacking democratic representation and aspiring to be an empire. The solution is, as far as I can tell, an attitude of humility in leadership. Think of it this way. Jordan Peterson's now iconic meme of "clean your room" has caught on, because before you announce your grand plans to create the utopia through top-down management of the entire planet, you should probably be capable of keeping your living space in order first. Keeping yourself clean is infinitely easier than keeping the world clean, and often enough the type of person that desires radical action to implement the latter can't even do the former. For example, the EU is on the verge of collapse. Is it no surprise that the president, Jean-Claude Juncker, has an alcohol problem?
Le dictateur arrive, dit-il, et le voici. Bam!
Or that European Parliament advocate for a federalized Europe, Guy Verhofstadt, tries in vain to look 30 years younger than he is, while demanding that the EU member states give the EU more sovereign power?
And that is the real problem, colleagues. Why there is such a problem in this crisis? Because member states are reluctant to transfer new sovereignty and powers to the European Union. And we all know that the only way out of this crisis is a new transfer of powers to the European Union.
The fundamental problem is that the EU is dysfunctional, but it works just well enough that the clowns in power think they understand it when they don't. And they believe that their limited understanding allows them to manipulate the system to induce grand social change, when all it really creates is grand social disaster. Of course, social systems require adjustment in order to properly function, and on some level, those social systems are required. But in that adjustment, humility comes into play, because the EU has shown us that simply marching in like you own the place, more often than not, leads to ruin. In politics, humility manifests as a desire to improve things, yes, but also as an understanding that being careful means sticking with what you know and starting out small, hence, clean your room. Or in the case of Juncker and Verhofstadt, clean up your acts. This is why there is an insistence to infantilize Britain due to the British desire to leave the EU. Europe views itself as the competent, wizened adult, even though it's really, really not. So child is the only role that the UK can be cast in. But unlike the prodigal son, the EU and the UK are not father and child. No maturity on the part of the EU is necessary for the two partners to break up. In fact, a breakup is probably a better metaphor, isn't it? Think about it. You've got two partners. And yeah, the UK is the woman in the relationship. The EU makes way more money, and the breakup is going to be tough on the UK. She'll have to leave his house and live in a dumpy apartment for a while. But she's no slouch either. She can land on her feet. And she's got many reasons to leave, too. Abuse? Gaslighting? Treating her like a child and not a partner, perhaps? And if you ever needed more proof that the EU was a bad boyfriend after all, look at his clingy, desperate behavior after she told him that they were through. Come on. Don't tell me these clowns don't look like they were nice guys back in college. A culture of safety has resulted in a class of British adults who, rather than deal with their own affairs, appeal to an ever greater authority, from parent to boss to state to superstate. And the EU, with all of its flaws and cracks, has gladly taken up the mantle of ultimate eternal authority. It hardly deserves such a position. For Brexit to be opposed, for the legitimate criticisms of the European project to be ignored, the infantilization of Britain is necessary, both internally and externally, because the only way for the EU to survive is to say to the British, quiet, the adults are talking.